The courtroom was cloaked in a heavy silence, the kind that settles over a room when everyone present knows that something irreversible is about to happen. Former police officer Daniel Reyes sat motionless at the defendant's table, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling slightly despite his effort to appear composed. His attorney, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, leaned in to whisper something encouraging, but Daniel didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the judge, who now prepared to read the verdict that would determine the course of his life. Rows of spectators filled the benches behind him, some strangers drawn by the media storm, others familiar faces that seemed more distant now than ever. At the very back of the courtroom, Daniel's wife, Melissa, sat with their 6-year-old daughter, Emma. The child was too young to understand the full weight of the moment, but old enough to sense that her world was about to change. She held tightly to her mother's hand, her eyes darting between the judge, the jury box, and her father. Daniel's heart pounded so loud he thought everyone could hear it. Every memory of his years on the force ran through his mind. The late-night patrols, the moments he risked his life for strangers, the commendations, the brotherhood. None of it mattered now. In the eyes of the law, he was no longer a protector. He was the accused, the man who had allegedly betrayed his oath and committed a crime that left a community shaken. The judge finally spoke, his voice firm but not without a trace of regret. In the case of the state versus Daniel Reyes, regarding the charges of obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and accessory to manslaughter, this court finds the defendant. He paused for a moment, looking over his glasses. Guilty on all counts. The words fell like a gavel to the soul. A collective gasp rose from the room. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth as her body tensed, while little Emma turned toward her, confused by the reaction. "Mommy, what did he say?" she asked, her small voice rising above the sudden murmuring. Daniel's body slumped ever so slightly, as if all the strength had drained out of him. His attorney placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, but there was no comfort to be found. He turned slowly to glance over his shoulder, and their eyes met, Daniel's and Emma's. It was a moment suspended in time. Her innocent face was creased with concern, her mouth slightly open, as though waiting for a smile or a reassurance that would never come. The bailiffs moved in, preparing to take Daniel into custody. Metal clinked softly as one of them pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Daniel didn't resist. He stood slowly, his eyes still on Emma, who had now climbed onto her seat to get a better look at her father. Melissa tried to hold her back, but the child leaned forward, whispering, "Why are they taking Daddy?" The chains around his wrist snapped into place. Daniel winced, not from the cold metal, but from the knowledge that this might be the last time his daughter would see him as a free man. He had failed her, not just as a father, but as the man she believed could fix anything, protect anyone. As the judge finalized the sentencing procedures, Daniel's voice broke the silence. It was raw, desperate, and full of restrained agony. "Your Honor," he said hoarsely, "before I go, may I please hug my daughter? Just once." The room fell silent again, even the reporters lowering their cameras. The judge looked at Daniel for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an answer that could either deepen the tragedy, or open a door to something far more unexpected. Daniel stood with his hands cuffed in front of him, wrists bound by the cold steel that now symbolized the end of everything he once believed he stood for. The courtroom, still heavy with the weight of the guilty verdict, was locked in a stunned silence. All eyes had shifted from the judge to the man who had once worn a badge with pride. His request echoed in the vast room, trembling in the air like a fragile thread stretched too tight. "Your Honor, before I go, may I please hug my daughter? Just once." The judge blinked slowly, his hands resting on the bench, expression unreadable. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some scoffed under their breath. Others, including a few veteran officers who had served alongside Daniel, dropped their eyes in sorrow. One of the prosecution attorneys leaned over to whisper something to the judge, likely discouraging the idea. But Daniel didn't look at any of them. He only looked at Emma. She was standing now on the courtroom bench, her tiny fingers clutching the wood railing in front of her. Her eyes, wide and tearful, searched her father's face for answers she didn't have the words to ask. Melissa had her hand on the child's back, gently pulling her down, trying to shield her from the spectacle, but Emma resisted. She didn't understand why Daddy was in handcuffs. Why everyone looked so sad. Why no one was letting her run to him like she always did after work. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. She's just a little girl, he said, more to the room than anyone in particular. She doesn't even know what's happening. Please. One hug. That's all I'm asking. The judge finally spoke, slowly and with a weight that suggested he was struggling against the system he represented. Mr. Reyes, this court does not generally permit physical contact between convicted individuals and civilians after sentencing. He paused, then added, more quietly, but under these circumstances. The prosecutor interjected firmly. Your Honor, this could set a precedent. Spare me the precedent, the judge snapped, uncharacteristically sharp. He looked toward the bailiff. If he makes one wrong move, you know what to do. The bailiff hesitated, then nodded. Melissa's eyes widened, and she crouched down to whisper in Emma's ear. Sweetheart, Daddy's going to come say goodbye. Just for a minute, okay. Emma nodded eagerly, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. Daniel was escorted forward a few paces, his chains clinking with each movement. His heart raced. He'd never felt so close and yet so far from something so important. The bailiff gestured to Melissa, who gently guided Emma down the aisle. As soon as Emma saw her father just a few steps away, she broke free and ran. Daddy! She cried. Daniel dropped to his knees, his arms already open. She flew into his embrace, and despite the chains, he wrapped her as tightly as he could. She fit perfectly in his arms, like she always had, his little girl with the too big heart and soft brown curls. He buried his face into her shoulder, breathing in her scent, memorizing the feel of her, knowing it might be the last time. I love you so much, he whispered. So much. Emma nodded against him. Don't go. I don't want to, he said, choking on the words. Then she pulled back, looked into his eyes, and said something that made the entire room lean in closer. I heard Uncle Mike say you didn't do anything wrong, he told someone it was all a trick. Daniel's eyes shot open. What did you say? I heard him. He said you had to take the blame, or else. Time seemed to freeze. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure if he should pull them apart. But the judge stood slowly, eyes locked on the girl. Daniel's grip on Emma tightened, not out of fear now, but realization. That one moment, one desperate plea for a final hug, had just cracked open a truth no one in that courtroom expected. The room was frozen in time. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The little girl's words had dropped into the courtroom like a stone in still water, rippling through every person present with silent disbelief. Daniel remained on his knees, clutching his daughter like she was both his lifeline and his last chance at holding onto what remained of his world. The bailiff stood motionless, caught between duty and something more human, hesitation. The judge leaned forward, his hands gripping the bench, his eyes narrowing with intent. Repeat what she said, he ordered quietly, not to Daniel, but to the court recorder. The soft click of keys filled the void as the girl's voice was read aloud again. I heard Uncle Mike say you didn't do anything wrong, he told someone it was all a trick. Daniel's face had drained of color. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the noise around him. He looked into Emma's eyes. Sweetheart, he asked gently, when did you hear this? Can you remember? Emma nodded. At Grandma's house. I was behind the couch. Uncle Mike was yelling on the phone. He said you didn't even know what really happened, and that, they bought it. He laughed. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Mike, his wife's brother. A man who had always hovered on the edge of trouble, who Daniel had reluctantly covered for once in the past when he'd been found drunk at a crash site. But this was different. This was intentional, calculated. The judge stood now, fully upright, his posture stiff. Miss Ruiz, he called to the prosecutor, how thoroughly was the defendant's brother-in-law vetted during the investigation? She hesitated, clearly thrown. He gave a statement. But he wasn't listed as a person of interest, there was no reason to suspect his involvement. Yet the child says he admitted guilt. Indirectly or otherwise. He turned to the defense attorney. Counselor, file an emergency motion for reconsideration. I want a transcript of this testimony, a statement from the child, and a full review of all communications involving Michael Tran. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Camera phones tilted forward again as people leaned over benches to catch every word. Melissa looked utterly stunned, her hand covering her mouth as her gaze shifted from Emma to Daniel. The judge turned to the bailiff. Uncuff him. For now. The officer hesitated, but the command was clear. With a soft rattle of keys, the cuffs were released from Daniel's wrists. He slowly stood, still holding Emma, his hands finally free. The ache in his shoulders melted beneath the wave of disbelief and a tiny bloom of hope he didn't yet trust. Emma looked up at him. "Are you coming home now?" He couldn't answer. Not yet. But he kissed her forehead, holding her close. "We're going to fix this," he said. Melissa approached slowly, tears running freely down her cheeks now. She wrapped her arms around both of them without a word. It was the first moment in weeks that didn't feel like drowning. The pain was still there, raw and close to the surface, but for the first time, Daniel could feel something else breaking through: clarity. As the judge called for a recess and ordered the courtroom cleared, Daniel was led out, not to prison, but to a private holding room. Investigators would question him again. The judge would review the evidence with new eyes. And the man he had once foolishly protected would now become the center of an entirely different trial. All because of one hug. One desperate, human request that had slipped past protocol and routine. A hug that saved everything. Daniel sat in a small consultation room off the main courtroom, still trying to steady his breathing. His hands, though now free of handcuffs, trembled with a mix of fear, anger, and the adrenaline of what had just happened. He could still feel the warmth of his daughter in his arms, the tiny weight of her body pressed against him, and the haunting clarity of her words ringing in his ears. "Uncle Mike said you didn't do anything wrong." Two plainclothes detectives entered the room, followed by his attorney, whose face was a mixture of disbelief and sudden urgency. "We've already requested the court to delay your transfer to state custody," the lawyer said quickly. "This changes things." Daniel looked up, his eyes sharp. She heard Mike. She heard him admit to something. "You believe her, don't you?" "I believe it's enough to dig deeper," the lawyer replied, motioning to the detectives. "They're going to ask you a few questions. Just stay calm and tell them everything you remember about Mike's involvement." The detectives nodded and began the questioning. "Mr. Reyes, when was the last time you saw Michael Tran before the charges were filed against you?" Daniel leaned forward. "About 2 days before Internal Affairs came knocking. He stopped by our house. Said he was sorry about the incident and that everything would blow over." "Did you notice anything strange in his behavior?" Daniel scoffed. "Mike is always strange. But that time, yeah. He was jittery. Wouldn't meet my eyes. Said something about things going further than expected. I figured he was just being his usual paranoid self. I didn't think it meant anything." One of the detectives jotted notes furiously while the other pressed further. "Do you know if he had access to any of the evidence in your case? Body cam footage, internal files, statements?" Daniel's brow furrowed. He used to work IT for the city. He got fired a while ago for tampering with a municipal server. "I didn't think it had anything to do with this case. But now..." The door burst open before Daniel could finish. A young officer entered, breathless, holding a printout. "We pulled Mike Tran's phone logs and got a warrant to access his cloud storage. You need to see this." He handed the papers to one of the detectives, who scanned them quickly, eyes widening. "He sent a voice message 3 days before Reyes was arrested. It's encrypted, but the metadata shows it was forwarded to an unknown contact labeled, Cleaner. We also found a deleted folder titled, Plan B." Daniel stood up. "He framed me. That's what this is, isn't it?" His lawyer nodded grimly. "It's looking that way." Just then, a second officer stepped in from the hallway, whispering something urgent to one of the detectives. The detective turned toward Daniel. "We just brought your daughter back in with a forensic child psychologist. She repeated the same story, word for word. Not only that, she gave us the date and time she overheard the call. We cross-referenced it with Mike's call records. It checks out." Daniel sat back down slowly, exhaling deeply. "So what now?" "Now," said the detective, "we bring him in. And we take your name off this case." Daniel felt the shift, like a gust of air finally blowing into a sealed, suffocating room. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt the weight begin to lift. It wasn't over yet. There was still a process to go through, still legal knots to untangle. But the walls were cracking, and the truth, finally, was beginning to find its way through. All because his daughter, small and soft-spoken, had whispered something no one else had dared to say. The courtroom, once a place of grim certainty, was now buzzing with disbelief. Emma's innocent but explosive revelation had sent shockwaves through the gallery, and no one quite knew what to do next. The judge had recessed proceedings, but whispers ricocheted off the wooden walls as people leaned toward one another, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Daniel had been taken to a secure side room with his attorney and 2 detectives, while court staff scrambled to gather transcripts, records, and statements. The gallery had not yet been cleared, and the tension in the room was growing by the second. Melissa sat motionless on the bench, Emma in her lap, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. Her face was pale, lips parted slightly as if she were still trying to form words. Her brother Mike's name had been spoken aloud, and the way the judge had responded, no dismissal, no denial, meant only one thing. This wasn't just a child's confusion. It might be real. Terrifyingly real. Across the room, reporters tapped furiously on their keyboards, phones held close to their mouths as they whispered updates into their recorders. They hadn't expected this. This was supposed to be a sentencing, a story of a fallen cop. Now, it was something far more complex. Possibly a case of wrongful conviction. Possibly a cover-up. Possibly a redemption. The prosecutor, visibly shaken, was now in heated discussion with one of her aides, pointing at documents, her voice rising. "We didn't have this." No one flagged the uncle. His name wasn't even in the original evidence chain. "You need to call the DA," her assistant whispered urgently. Judge Monroe re-entered the courtroom unexpectedly, gavel in hand. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood behind the bench, waiting until the room went still again. "This court has reviewed the preliminary information brought forth from the child's statement and corroborating metadata from newly accessed digital logs," he announced. "In light of this, all current sentencing is paused until further notice." Gasps and murmurs broke out again. The bailiff raised his voice. Quiet in the courtroom. The judge continued. "A formal investigation into Michael Tran, the defendant's brother-in-law, will be opened immediately. Any individual found to have withheld or manipulated evidence relevant to this case will be charged accordingly." Melissa looked down at Emma, who now clung quietly to her. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but her mother's tight embrace and the eyes of every person in the room glued to them told her something important had just shifted. Then chaos erupted. From the back of the courtroom, a man bolted toward the exit. He wore a baseball cap and sunglasses, but the second Melissa caught sight of his gait, her breath caught in her throat. "That's Mike," she gasped, standing up. The bailiffs moved instantly, and within seconds, the man was tackled just feet from the double doors. The sunglasses flew off, the cap tumbled to the floor, and sure enough, it was Michael Tran. He screamed as they pinned him down. "You don't know what you're doing. Let me go." The judge slammed his gavel. "Restrain him and take him into custody for questioning." Everyone was on their feet now. Reporters shouted questions. Lawyers scrambled for statements. One woman fainted in the corner of the gallery. Melissa clutched Emma tighter as the child buried her face in her mother's chest. In the hallway, Daniel, escorted by 2 detectives, heard the commotion. He turned to his lawyer. "What happened?" "They caught Mike," his lawyer replied, eyes wide. "He ran. And now everyone's watching." Daniel stood still for a moment, then nodded slowly. The tide had turned. The truth wasn't just being uncovered, it was fighting its way into the light, dragging everything and everyone with it. Michael Tran sat in a sterile interrogation room, his wrists shackled to the cold metal table, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the air-conditioned chill. He refused to meet anyone's eyes. 2 detectives stood across from him, one calm and calculated, the other pressing in with quiet intensity. Every angle of the room was recorded. Every breath he took was monitored. Across town, in the district attorney's office, a flurry of activity was underway. The discovery of deleted files, the suspicious phone calls, and now Michael's attempted escape had upended the prosecution's entire foundation. The once airtight case against Daniel Reyes was crumbling fast, and now, for the first time, people were admitting they might have rushed to judgment. Daniel himself remained in the courthouse, seated with his attorney in a private waiting chamber. Though the shock hadn't worn off, he carried himself differently now, no longer the defeated man sentenced to prison, but a father and officer staring down a shot at justice. Emma had been taken home with Melissa under court protection. She'd been through enough. Back in the interrogation room, the lead detective placed a folder on the table in front of Michael and opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, phone transcripts, digital logs, and a list of items recovered from his cloud storage. Plan B, the detective said flatly. Care to explain what that means? Mike stared at the photos, jaw tight, saying nothing. The second detective leaned in. We've got your call logs. The voice message you forwarded to that burner number. We matched the voice. You said, and I quote, "Don't worry, the idiot took the fall. It's over." That was 3 days before Daniel's arrest. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers flexing under the chains. Still, he said nothing. We also recovered a city-issued hard drive from your old tech locker, the first detective continued. It was erased, but our guys pulled a corrupted video file from it. Body cam footage. Real footage. The original one. The one where Daniel clearly radios for backup and follows procedure. You knew it proved his innocence, and you buried it. Michael finally looked up, his lips twitching. He knew what he was getting into, he muttered. He covered for me once before. I figured, what's one more? The confession, though quiet, was clear enough for the mics to capture. The detectives exchanged a quick glance. The weight of what he had just said settled over the room like concrete. You framed a cop, the second detective said slowly. Your own brother-in-law. You let his 6-year-old daughter think her father was a criminal. Michael leaned back, his face hard. I didn't ask him to play hero. He just never knew when to shut up and mind his own business. Across town, a team of forensic analysts finalized the restoration of the missing body cam footage. The video, now playing on a large monitor in the DA's office, showed a completely different narrative than what had been used in court. Daniel had acted appropriately. He had followed every step by the book. The edited footage that had been presented as evidence. That had clearly been tampered with. Within the hour, the DA herself signed an emergency petition to vacate the conviction. A formal apology was drafted. An arrest warrant was issued for Michael Tran not just for obstruction and perjury, but for conspiracy and evidence tampering. When Daniel's lawyer received the call, he simply closed his folder and looked up. They're dropping everything. You're free. Daniel didn't speak for a moment. His body sagged with the weight of it all, a strange numbness overtaking him. He'd known he was innocent, but to have the system admit it was something else entirely. He finally stood, exhaling the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. I need to go home, he said quietly. My daughter's waiting. Michael Tran sat silently in a holding cell at the city detention center, no longer the arrogant, elusive man who had tried to escape a courtroom. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his hands resting in his lap, he stared at the floor with hollow eyes. The weight of his confession, the evidence stacking against him, and the reality of what he had done had begun to sink in. Gone was the defiance from the interrogation room. Now there was only a shell of a man who realized too late that the lie he had spun had unraveled entirely. Earlier that morning, he had been escorted before a federal magistrate for a formal arraignment. The charges read aloud included obstruction of justice, perjury, conspiracy to falsify evidence, and wrongful implication in a homicide investigation. The judge's tone was cold, professional, and unmoved by the frail, "Not guilty," Michael had muttered. His bail was denied. The courtroom, much quieter than before, now held a somber, almost disappointed energy. There was no media circus this time, just the shame of a man who had tried to ruin another's life to save his own. Meanwhile, Daniel Reyes stood outside the courthouse in the sunlight, no longer bound by cuffs or escorted by guards. His clothing had changed, no longer the standard issue inmate uniform, but a plain button-down shirt and jeans his wife had brought him. His hands, once shackled in chains, now gripped a manila envelope that contained official paperwork confirming the dismissal of all charges. Daniel's lawyer stood beside him, shaking hands with the press but leaving his client space to breathe. For Daniel, it wasn't about cameras or statements. It wasn't about revenge, either. It was about something much more personal. He had cleared his name. More importantly, he had done it in time for his daughter to understand who her father really was. Melissa arrived minutes later with Emma. When the little girl spotted her father, she broke into a full sprint, arms open, curls bouncing as she ran. Daniel crouched low and caught her mid-run, lifting her into the air and holding her tightly to his chest. He closed his eyes, letting the feeling of her presence anchor him to this new reality, one where he was no longer a convicted man, no longer a headline, no longer a shadow behind bars. You're not going away anymore. she asked quietly, her face pressed into his neck. No, Daniel whispered, voice breaking. Daddy's home. For good. Melissa approached, her eyes full of tears. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around them both. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were a family again, whole, without fear. Inside the courthouse, the judge who had presided over Daniel's conviction quietly signed the final motion to vacate the verdict. He paused for a moment before signing, then added a note at the bottom: reconsideration granted due to new evidence and credible witness testimony from minor defendant's record to be expunged. In the days that followed, news outlets revised their narratives. What was once a story of betrayal and disgrace became a story of wrongful accusation, family resilience, and a justice system that, despite its flaws, had ultimately corrected its course. Daniel didn't care much for the headlines. What mattered to him was far simpler: walking his daughter to school without fear. Sitting at the dinner table without the silence of absence. Holding Melissa's hand without feeling guilt. And knowing that the one moment of vulnerability in that courtroom, a single hug, had sparked a chain reaction that set the truth free. And now, so was he. The sun was beginning to set as Daniel Reyes stepped through the gates of the county detention facility for the last time. The air outside felt different, cooler, freer. He paused for a moment just beyond the threshold, closing his eyes and letting the golden light fall on his face. It wasn't just the end of his time behind bars, it was the start of something new. Something reclaimed. The ache in his chest, the one that had lived there since the day he was arrested, was finally easing. He wasn't walking out in shame. He was walking out in truth. A row of black SUVs waited along the curb. Reporters were held back by a roped-off section, their camera flashes blinking like fireflies. But none of it mattered to Daniel. He wasn't looking for an audience. His eyes scanned the crowd until he saw them: Melissa, standing tall and proud, and next to her, Emma, who waved both arms wildly the moment she saw him. He didn't walk toward them. He ran. Emma let go of her mother's hand and sprinted toward her father, laughing, her little shoes thudding against the pavement. Daniel scooped her up mid-run, lifting her high into the air before pulling her close against his chest. Her small arms wrapped around his neck like vines, strong and sure. It was the hug he had dreamed of in his darkest hours. The hug that had changed everything. "You're really back," she whispered in his ear, like she still didn't quite believe it. "I'm really back," Daniel replied, tears slipping silently down his face. Melissa joined them moments later, wrapping them both in her arms. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. The way she looked at him said everything: relief, apology, pride, and love all wrapped into one breathless gaze. They stood like that for a long time, ignoring the world, the noise, and the questions shouted from behind cameras. They didn't owe anyone an answer. Not right now. This moment belonged only to them. One of the reporters shouted, "Mr. Reyes, do you have any comment on your release?" Daniel turned slightly, still holding Emma, and met the reporter's eyes. His voice was calm, steady. "Yeah, sometimes, the system gets it wrong. But sometimes, it also gets a second chance." He didn't say more. There was nothing more to say. They got into Melissa's car, a modest, old sedan that somehow felt like the safest place in the world. Emma chatted excitedly in the back seat, telling her father all the things she had saved up in his absence: her school projects, a drawing of their house, a letter she had written for Santa even though it was July. Daniel listened intently, his heart full. Every word, every laugh, was a reminder that this life, his life, was waiting for him all along. Back at home, Daniel walked slowly through the front door. The smell of lemon cleaner, mixed with the familiar scent of wood and sunlight, hit him like a memory. Everything looked the same, but it felt different. Brighter. Warmer. His old badge sat in a small frame on the entry table. He paused and looked at it for a long moment before setting it aside and walking into the living room, where Emma was already curled up with her favorite stuffed bear, waiting for a bedtime story. That night, as he tucked her into bed, she asked, "Is everything okay now?" Daniel kissed her forehead and whispered, "It is now, baby girl. Because you spoke the truth. And the truth brought me home." She smiled and closed her eyes, drifting to sleep in the safety of her father's arms. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Daniel sat quietly beside her bed, no longer a man running from injustice, but a man returned, whole, redeemed, and surrounded by love.